My name is Marisa Mancillas, and my assistant, my undergraduate assistant from the summer, Justin Lopez, is here. And throughout the talk, I'll be kind of handing it off to him, and we'll be going back and forth a little bit. And as all of you may know, my advisor is Dr. Fuentes Soriano and also Dr. Prihadko. Her name should be on here, so that's an error. But I'm just gonna get started. You know, my blast from the past, Oregon Mountains, historical ecology. And I just like to start my talks with a land acknowledgement. So just acknowledging that my study site, the Oregon Mountains, is the occupied ancestral homelands of the Apache, Diné, Puebloan, and Piro Manzo Tiwa indigenous people, as well as other indigenous groups. So that's the land that I'm working on, and the deep history. I'll be just kind of scratching the surface of the history. So the structure of our talk, Justin and I's talk, we'll kind of introduce ourselves, and then I'll provide some background on the project. And I know that a lot of you may have already seen this presentation during the previous, the big conference in Alamogordo, but if you're willing to, if you could give me a thumbs up if you were at that event and saw my presentation already. Okay, some, but not all. So it won't be too much of review, but I'm still gonna go through some of the backgrounds, like the ideas surrounding the research, and then covering some of the methods. So the archive work or the historical work, I'll pass over to Justin, and then I'll talk a little bit about the field work component that I got to do this last fall. And then the data mining with the plant specimen occurrence records or herbaria occurrences, and then some preliminary results and next steps. So my name is Marisa Mancillas. Again, I'm in the Animal and Range Sciences Department, getting my master's in rangeland ecology. And previously, I received my Bachelor's of Science in Ecological Restoration from the University of Montana in 2016. And before that, I had an associate's from a junior college in California, where I'm from. So in between getting my bachelor's degree and my master's, I worked in 10 different Western states on a variety of projects, on like restoration projects, reclamation projects, a lot of like endangered species work, invasive species, and generally always in a grass dominated ecosystem. I just love grasses and working with grasses. So you can see the little black dot here. I've made my way down to the Las Cruces area. And I'll pass it over to Justin and he can introduce himself.
Awesome. So hello, everyone. Thank you again, Marisa and everyone, for having us. We really appreciate it. As mentioned, my name is Justin Lopez. I was born and raised here in Las Cruces, so I've been here all 21 years of my life. I haven't explored the Southwest like Marisa has, but we'll see if my future career takes me down that path. Right now, I am working on my bachelor's at NMSU with a Fisheries and Wildlife Conservation Ecology degree. Hoping to also get some minors under my belt in horticulture and biology. That's still a work in progress. Still getting ready to wrap up my degree here in the next few semesters. Outside of school, I enjoy camping, hiking, any outdoor recreation. If it's outdoors, you can find me there. And with school, I hope to continue to hopefully get a master's degree in this field, and hopefully that can further my career options and allow me to work more with natural resources. And outside of school completely, I hope to land something with the government or even federal agencies, which will be top of my list. And with that being said, I'll go ahead and hand it back to Marisa, and she'll continue with her presentation as well.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Yeah, Justin has been such a pleasure to work with. I just wanted to say that my heart is swelling with joy at his introduction. Anyways, So a lot of you here probably have spent some time in the Oregon Mountains, and it's a wonderful place. Here's just a map to demonstrate kind of the orientation of the Oregon Mountains next to Las Cruces to the east, or the mountains are to the east of Las Cruces. And you can see, even just from this picture, it's just a really complicated, like topographically interesting place. Lots of steep slopes and things like that. So the kind of thought process, or like the like impetus to my project, is in the context of global climate change. So some models predict that in kind of the next 50 years, there will be an average decrease in precipitation by 20% in the Southwest, and also kind of a increase in mean temperature by about 2 degrees. So fewer freezing days, longer hot, like warm seasons, and this kind of scene with the Oregon Mountains covered in snow will be kind of less often. And you may recognize this man as Charles Darwin. So he had this idea about temperature and species and geographical distributions, that cold temperatures are really important in limiting the distribution of plants or different species. So as temperatures increase, we expect that, you know, species will move up in latitude or up in elevation. So that's really the idea that we're testing. So I also, another way to think of it, that I like to think of it like, is, you know, in the summertime, which at least for me feels like so long ago, when it's really, really hot, and if you don't have air conditioning and you can't get in the pool, you know, where do you go? And you go either up in latitude, you drive to Silver City, or maybe you go up the mountain and it's cooler there. And that's, you know, just the way that elevation is mediating temperature. So are we seeing plants doing that same thing? And when I start to think about this, I think about all the different factors that really could be at play, because it can't be just so simple that every single plant is doing the same thing in the same way and just all moving up in elevation. You know, I think about soil, slope. Is it a north-facing slope, a south-facing slope? Is it a draw? What kind of like individualistic characteristics does that plant have? What's their like different genetic makeup? What kind of traits are associated with that? Things like that. So it's really complicated. And for us here, we all love plants, but it's important to note, you know, this can have some really serious implications. So if species are moving up in this way, or when they do move up in elevation in this way, they can be kind of lost off of the top of the mountain, either to go extinct or just locally extirpated. So this can have cascading effects on ecosystem structure and function, which can affect wildlife populations and habitat, and also other really important values that we get from the Oregon Mountains and other places like it, like recreation, tourism, and spiritual values. This picture represents kind of the same concept. So as elevation increases, the plant communities are different at different elevations because of the effect of elevation on temperature. And we can see this in the Oregon Mountains. There's kind of a desert grassland, like a more shrubby oak plant community. And then, I mean, for us, this would already be kind of shifted farther up, but we can see like pine trees and at least there used to be some fir trees up there. And just to kind of say it in another way about how special the Oregon Mountains are, these maps show biodiversity hotspots in New Mexico, and this little arrow is pointing to the Oregon Mountains. It ranks as outstanding, the highest biodiversity ranking in the state. So it's really important to study these things and how these plants might be being affected there. And I'm lucky to have the guidance of Dr. Fuentes and Dr. Prihodko in thinking about like, what kind of framework should I look at this? And the framework we're looking into it is historical ecology. How can we understand this without understanding the past? And historical ecology often uses kind of unconventional data sources, so handwritten notes, hand-drawn maps, specimens. So it's like being a detective of ecology, and that's one thing that I really love about it. And here's just all the different steps of my project. So starting with the historical records, and then also going to the different herbaria and plant specimen databases to take that information and develop a monitoring design to collect contemporary data, and working with that contemporary data that already exists. And then the next steps are analysis and comparing over time to see what we can learn. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Justin again, and he's going to talk about his experience, and he fits really into this first step of the historical ecology and the archival records.
Yeah, so as Marisa mentioned, this project has a large scope, and when I was first brought on or accepted onto this project, it was overwhelming, it was intimidating, and I was wondering, well, where am I going to fit in? I'm an undergraduate student and we're working with climate change, world crisis problem. But when I took a step back and was able to focus on the little aspects as to the project itself, I found my little niche. And my overview, or the way I looked at the project, as Marisa mentioned, we had plant communities that were migrating up in elevation due to climate change and other factors, whether it be abiotic or biotic. And in order to monitor that based on historical ecology and contemporary ecology, we had to use historical records to compare and contrast. And in addition, we're using modern day management plans and surveying methods, such as AIM through the Bureau of Land Management. And we did that in the Oregon Mountains. And we also got to do some plant sampling, collecting. So some hands-on work, all of which that contributed to Marisa's project that we have now. And just to visually represent that, all these different aspects helped contribute into like monitoring sites where we worked out in the Oregon Mountains. And the circle highlighted in orange is my portion or my contribution to the project. And I'm really excited to talk about it and really proud of the work that came out of it. So I was creating taxonomic checklists for Marisa and the team. A good way to compare this to is a study guide for a test. I'm sure anyone here has any experience in academia. You've been handed a study guide and you have a test, whether it be chemistry, biology, English. You're hoping that that material on your study guide that you've been handed or that you made yourself relates somewhat to the material that's going to be on the test. And there's no way to get a verbatim copy of what exactly is going to be on the test, but you can get a gist of what is going to be on there. And in hopes you study that study guide and you get good results out on your test. Transitioning that to our project that we had, our test was the Oregon Mountains, and our checklist that I created was our study guide. So we wanted to know before we went out there, just out in the blue, what we could expect. We wanted to be prepared before we just head out there and just be more prepared before we head out and hike the high elevations of the Oregons that take hours to get to, and in hopes that we have a good success rate on our tests in the field work. And as mentioned, we extract a lot of historical data, and that came to fruition as checklists. Now, that process wasn't just something that happened in one given day, in one weekend, in 1 week. This took a good portion of my internship with Marisa, and this diagram kind of allows it to flow into the end result on the right, which is that checklist that I was talking about. But starting here on the left is where we spent most of our days. Me and Marissa were putting in about 8-9 hour days with 30-minute lunch breaks, just reading large textbooks that came from historical records that were available to us at NMSU Library. And these pages, as you can see in the next picture over, the pages are really big. They're very thin parchment with a lot of cursive text, and we had to sift through those pages each individually and record what came out of those books, whether it be that they went on a trip and recorded X amount of plants, the species that they collected, what they saw on that trip. So we just pulled all that information that we could and try to confine it into a taxonomic checklist. And preceding the text, someone had to have written those or recorded them. And the earliest individuals that we focused on, we have here on the left-hand side, Townsend. He was a good portion or contributor to our research that we had available. He had a manuscript titled The Life Zones of the Organs, and it was really beneficial to us to look at because not much had been published or even acknowledged about the Organ Mountains. So he was one of the first to do that, and it led us in a good direction and also put a good foundation to what we could expect. And then on the right-hand side, this gentleman, very well known in the Southwest, and I'm assuming across all of the United States, Elmer Otis Wooten, the pioneer botanist that was located here in the Doñana County, southern New Mexico, worked from 1890 to 1911. And as mentioned there, he has approximately 35,000 records of herbarium specimens that have been saved and pressed. And me and Marissa had the opportunity to work not just with those, but even texts that he had, whether it be old exams that he wrote himself that had different plant names on them, or even a diary that he kept on the travels that he went to across the state. So there's a lot of information that was available from both just these two gentlemen. And some other individuals that we focused on and some agencies that we worked with. On the left-hand side, we have the rangeland monitoring team through the BLM. We got these pictures through their records, and it just kind of shows how the progression happened from historical ecology, and we're working our way up to more contemporary ecology. And on the right-hand side, William H. Moyer, he also had some important texts that we looked at, and he contributed to our data and helped me construct these multiple taxonomic checklists. And so all these screenshots that you see here are biodiversity portals. This was probably one of the biggest tools that I had access to. I'd known only of SciNet before this, and I was introduced to all these other different ones. And all these tools that I had here helped me eliminate a problem that occurs very commonly with historical records. And that's going to be addressed here on this next slide. So we have this plant here, I'm sure everyone's familiar with, but however, in historical records, or if you know the name of the plant, feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand. But a big problem that we had with historical records is that we had different individuals that were collecting said specimen and had different names for these plants. And, that's okay. There wasn't any standardization in data back then. It was kind of a freelance science field, if you could think about that. So all these different names here had different authorships, different species, different genus. And we ran into that issue when trying to cross-reference all these different, these samples that were recorded. But what we wanted, and my goal, was to produce a taxonomic checklist that had a specific name that was designated to a specific plant. That way we knew whether we were talking a record from 1890 or from 1970, we were looking at Laria tridentata because that was the accepted name across all these biodiversity portals. So we just wanted accuracy and clarification on different samples and records that were available to us. And as mentioned, our fruit of the labor was our taxonomic checklist. This is just a screenshot of one of the three that I created under the guidance of Marisa and Dr. Fuentes. They were awesome in helping me do this. They gave me a lot of tools, a lot of resources, and a lot of encouragement to get it done. And I was glad I was able to develop these skills with them. And these checklists are available online digitally, and they're going to help Marisa in her project with however she wishes to take these study guides, or also known as checklists, and prepare with them. And we can go on to the next slide there. And just some statistical data that came from my internship. So all these, well, this bar graph represents the amount of species, family, and genera that were extracted from the historical records and then transformed and clarified via those taxonomical portals and represented it here. So, I mean, you can see there's a lot of species, a lot of genera, a lot of families, and all these came from early individuals, early naturalists. And we're hoping to have that data to compare to modern times now and help Marisa with the climate change and migration of plants up in elevation. Personally, I was able to develop great skills, work with great people. I created a guide to the test, and I'm very proud of that. And I hope Marisa can use this data in her research, and hopefully in the future, if it works out, we can do some more checklists or do some more discoveries with this data. And in addition to that, I was able to help monitor species richness, biodiversity, and ecology. And I feel like that's going to help with this field that I'm in. I was in fisheries and wildlife conservation ecology. It's a broad field. I learned a great skill that can be applied to different angles of this field. And on a side note, there was a lot of cursive in those texts. And as a millennial, I'm proud that I can say I'm efficient in reading cursive and writing in cursive now. And yeah, so I'll go ahead and pass it back to Marisa.
Before I go on to, I just want to say Justin's work was really, really critical. The oldest records, the work that he did, like he generated information that was available nowhere else. And it's so important for understanding the past, and it'll be so important for my analysis. So I just want to say that. But now I'm going to start talking about the fieldwork component, working with some modern data sets. So I'm sure some people are familiar with the assessment, inventory, and monitoring method that's part of the Bureau of Land Management. And you can see this is a map of the Oregon Mountains, and the areas that I'm working are all managed by the BLM. So in total, this map is showing these AIM plots that they both collect like species richness and diversity, but also like ecosystem or vegetation structure, the gaps between plants, and different things that are more standardized in a way that can be used going forward to detect change. So including the 15 plots that I contributed, now I have 52 AIM plots in the Oregon Mountains. So it's the purple dots and the yellow dots. The yellow dots are the ones that I contributed, and I'm hoping to go back and do some more. And there's also these diversity plots, which Patrick Alexander, the BLM botanist, does as kind of an additional method. It's just a 10-meter radius species list, but really, really, really important information. So his diversity plots, I'm building off of that. So I also collected some more diversity plots. You could see I went really, really high up in elevation for some of these. This was at the peak of like near Baylor Peak, but like on a ridge going north. And there's a picture of me collecting specimens. I tried as hard as I could to collect as many specimens whenever I could for researchers going forward that will need physical documentation of the biodiversity. And this is just some other field photos. So this is one of my AIM plots, and you could see that, the whole world is kind of on a slant. So it was pretty challenging and fun, and it was always an adventure going up there to look at these plots. And I really loved identifying all of these plants. And another thing that was pretty intense was just getting through the shrubbery. So, I had a random sample based on elevation. So if the plot landed in the middle of a tree, I still had to do it. You could see me here in the shrub. And this is a photo that I have from the field that I liked, that I think is kind of like showing some plant community turnover in a way that would indicate kind of some effects of climate or temperature. So you can see this is like an old juniper tree that used to be quite large, or is quite large, and it was burned in a fire at some point. And you can see some of it's regenerating. But you can also see this cactus is very, very happy in this environment. And I noticed a lot of cactus at all sorts of elevations doing really well, despite probably some temporary freezes. And now I'm going to talk about the biodiversity records, or the herbaria data that I've been able to work with and do some filtering and cleaning. So I'm starting with 90,000 records, or approximately 90,000 records from 6 different biodiversity repositories. And from that, I'm paring it down for the Oregon Mountains, and then also cleaning that data and putting it in shape to be analyzed. And this map is showing the occurrences or the records through time, with the red dots being kind of the oldest records and the blue dots being the newest. So I'm working with a lot of points. And I started working with the data. I don't know if I didn't mention this, but I'm actually at the Society for Range Management conference right now. So I prepared this data for this conference. I have a little stuffed cow to prove it, that I'm at the conference. But yeah, so this is some figures that I made. So this is the print for the species is very small, but it's not what's important. I was working with just Poaceae family through time and looking at the frequency of records. So one of the first steps that I expect to take is just to look at which species were recorded often enough to be used for analysis. So it's pretty small, but you could see that Bouteloua hirsuta was collected very frequently through time. And I also like doing this because it shows the element of history that's important here. So you can see from 1900 to 1950, there was a lot fewer records. It's just kind of 0 to 4. And I think this is probably because Elmer Otis Wooten left the state in 1910, 1911. And also, there was the war, World War II. So that probably affected just the amount of research being done in the Oregons, or people kind of collecting plants. And also in the 1800s, there was a big push to understand the diversity. So another thing I expect to do is look at these occurrence records and look at these, where plants are growing in terms of different traits that might indicate a sensitivity to temperature or climate. So photosynthetic pathway is really good at showing that. So the C3 pathway is associated with kind of cooler climates. It's not as water efficient as the C4 pathway. So C4 grasses, this is a plot of C4 grasses, C4 and C3 grasses collected through time. And C4 grasses would be much more effective in drought and hot conditions, and better with water. So it's pretty intuitive that we would expect more C4 grasses overall. But when I look at this, what I think is that, if this work is being done in 50 years from now, in 100 years from now, maybe people would see that the C3 grasses kind of drop away completely as temperatures increase. This is another figure that shows the same dynamic, but just spatially in a map. So we have our C3 grasses in yellow and our C4 grasses in blue. And each of these boxes is the same kind of time period, 1800 to 1900, and then in increments of 50 until we get to 2001 to 2022. And we can see, and these lines represent elevation contours. So we could see even from the oldest map that the C3 grasses are just better represented in these higher elevations. And we see the same pattern. And then the pattern becomes kind of stronger as we go through time. And the most recent one, we could see it really emerging that all these C4 grasses are really collected a lot more in lower elevations where it's hotter. And the C3 grasses are in these microclimates or really high elevation spots. Another thing that I really hope to do as part of this project is account for all of the biodiversity in the Oregon Mountains. It's pretty amazing that we have all this research in this area, but we don't have a checklist, a full checklist for the Oregon Mountains. It's really hard to know what you're losing if you don't know what you have. So this is a phylogenetic tree of the species in the Oregons, just from some of the data mining I've done. And since we were talking about grasses, I've kind of highlighted the grass lineage area. And as far as next steps, my future directions, my next steps are really to analyze this data and put it in a situation where I can look for patterns and trends for different species that are really frequently collected or looked at a lot, and what kind of traits might be indicators. How could landscape position, slope, aspect, elevation be impacting movement through time? And hopefully all this work can kind of build into proof of concept to do more long-term monitoring of the Oregons, with the perspective of history involved, bringing everything from the past forward and then going forward in a standardized kind of methodical way to detect change. And I'm going to pass it back to Justin. He's going to talk about some of the work that he's done since he worked with me this last summer.
Yeah, so thank you again, Marissa. Unfortunately, I'm not working with Marissa currently. That was a summer position that I had. And as mentioned earlier, it was a great opportunity. And I've been able to take away a lot of valuable skills that can be implemented into a broad scope of conservation and ecology. Currently, at the moment, this semester specifically, I've been focusing on aquatics. This does fisheries habitat, riparian areas. So I still have a little tie to plants, and I still love plants. Still, any plant class I've taken at NMSU has been one of the best times of my life. I've loved learning about them, found a new passion for them. But now I want to broaden the scope of opportunities that can be available to me and still work with natural resources. And just to have a little fun display here, this is what I consider my office. I get to work outside with natural resources, enjoy nature, all while preserving it for future generations. And up top, the fourth pictures up top, this is the most recent fisheries aquatic work that I've done. This was out in Arizona, near and in conjunction with the Gila Wilderness. We're working in a really remote location. This was with a graduate student by the name Kelsey Field. I've also worked, am currently working with Michael Miller, another graduate student. He's doing brook trout, which is the fish that you see in the orange bucket there. And then we also have on the right-hand side, while I was in Arizona, we actually got to capture and release a few of the endangered Gila chub that was out there. Very beautiful fish. I was honored to hold an endangered species. All an opportunity, you know, Marisa held my first internship position. She made me comfortable working at internships, and this led to a bunch of different opportunities for me. And on the bottom, this was one of my favorite hikes that I had. Me and Marisa teamed up about 4:40 in the morning. It was completely dark. We couldn't find each other to meet at the right location. We were scrambling around in our vehicles. We finally met up. We got to do a survey out in the Oregon Mountains, so up in elevation here. And it took us until about 2 o'clock to get back down. So we were up there all day, you know, collecting plants. Yeah. I think there's a hand raised, but not too sure.
Oh yeah, let's go ahead.
That was quite a presentation. Yeah, this is an amazing amount of work you're doing here. I was wondering, I've been working on the resource management plan for the Oregon Mountain Desert Peaks National Monument. And one of the things that came up was riparian areas and wetlands, for that matter, in the national monument. So my question is to you, would you say did you find, and how many of you did, riparian areas in the Oregon Mountains?
Yes.
Definitely. Oh,
Or you can go ahead, Marisa. Yeah.
no, you go first, and I'll go after.
Okay. So the riparian areas that are available out there wouldn't fit into like a typical, in my opinion, wouldn't fit into this typical description of riparian area. You know, you have a lot of, or for instance, in this picture here, you have a lot of vegetation cover that's covering the water source itself. That's actually a really good example there. This is a very wet monsoon season that we had, which me and Marisa were very lucky for. But in particular, I don't believe Marisa and I were looking for it per se, but I don't know if we overlapped with that information. That would maybe be something that we could come back to and see the type of species that we collected and see if they occur specifically in riparian areas that are available out in the Oregons.
So you're talking about the waterfall there?
Yeah, so there's
now,
a lot of green.
Where is that?
That's
which one?
going to be
Fillmore Canyon.
Fillmore Canyon, yeah.
Oh, it's Fillmore. Okay.
Yeah, I
Continue.
think I was just going to say, so as I'm assuming, I'm sure you know the AIM, the methods, the way that the AIM monitoring program is structured. They do like a stratified random sample based on soil or ecological site. I think it's soil type, but or like soil map unit. And because I want to work with the AIM data and contribute to it, I just used, my sampling design was a random stratified sample by elevation. And because I went with that approach, I did not end up sampling kind of more like special areas like riparian areas, or I almost wish that I had selected special sampling sites for riparian areas or places that I might expect to see extra biodiversity or a really different community. But yeah, I haven't focused on those areas specifically.
Yeah, well, you answered my second question too, and that was how did you decide where your spot should be? So it was random by elevation?
Yeah, I broke it into 300-meter increments, but then, I did run into some problems. So I removed all the areas that were over a 45-degree slope. But still, the highest elevations are the areas we're most interested in, and they're the hardest to get to. So many points I tried to get to, and it was not possible. So I had to start choosing randomly in a different way. And I'll probably have to acknowledge that when I write all of this up. It's like, okay, it has to be accessible, and then I'll randomize once I'm there. But
okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
are there any other questions? I think that there was one slide to, oh wait. Oh, of course. To share with Justin's information so that if anybody has any like thoughts or suggestions for him at this stage in his career with his interests in wildlife and with aquatic systems, I think I'll put, or maybe Justin, you can put your email in the chat. So if people
Yeah,
feel
I can go ahead and do that. And yeah, as Marisa mentioned, feel free, any questions or any advice, I'm all ears. And with that being said, I'll leave it to Marisa there.
Yeah. Any questions?
Marisa, I see pictures in here of many people. Can you tell us who they are?
Yes, so this is my acknowledgement slide. So I could walk through it. So these are lots of, this one is a photo of me. I'm not sure that you can see my cursor or not.
Yes, we can.
Good. So Charlene Juanico, she's right here. She also interned with me in the fall, was really, really helpful. We did a bunch of field work together. This is Gail Tree, and they're another graduate student at NMSU studying wind erosion dynamics. And this is Joshua Martinez, and he volunteered with me many, many days doing field work and collecting specimens. And on this list, I also wanted to thank graduate students who came out and volunteered. So Amberly Berry, Micah Funk, James Lee. I think James is on a couple slides ago, and also my funding and supporting groups. So the Bureau of Land Management and USDA NIFA, the enhancement program, and a special thanks to the NMSU Special Collections at the Branson Library, and the staff there really, really were so helpful.
Okay.
And of course, my advisors. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. You specialize in grasses. One of your charts showed, you talked about the C3 and the C4, and the C4 can handle drought better. I guess I'm wondering, of course, that means that, once upon a time, Las Cruces was grassland until it was overgrazed and whatever. And now we don't see it except in the higher mountains. Is the very nutritious grass, the grama grass, is that a C3 or C4? And the introduced awful grass, the layman's love grass, is is that one that's going to survive better?
And Sarah is here to correct me, but I'm pretty sure that Aragrassis is C4, but the black grama, I'm not totally sure.
Actually, both of them are C4.
Okay.
One is just more invasive than the other one, and that's the problem.
That's the invasive one. That was
the lemongrass, the lovegrass, yeah.
Yeah.
So because it's more invasive, it's just competing against our natives, and it's just have an advantage over them. It's competing on the same grounds, physiologically speaking.
Right. And things that eat, because I do realize that they're deer up in those mountains, and perhaps oryx, whatever, they probably tend to eat the native grasses too. I guess the problem, the cattle don't like the layman's love grass and prefer the natives. So is that contributing to the increase of the layman's grasses because animals don't want to eat it as much as they want to eat the nutritious native grasses?
Well, I can speak kind of anecdotally about this and what I've kind of seen, and then maybe Sarah can, if she has things to add, or anybody else has anything to add. What I've noticed is actually the layman's love grass, at least on the western side of the Oregon Mountains, isn't really very dominant. It seems
No.
as if, and I also looked at some of the, some of the lower elevations, and a lot of the Oregon mountains are still permitted to ranchers. I think everything but the Dripping Springs area. So, but yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. So I know, and at least in the past, so I think that if I was anecdotally thinking of an impact of grazing in those areas, would kind of just be a shrub encroachment, more so than an increase in the layman's love grass. And the other thing, I think that, one of my coworkers or fellow graduate students studies oryx, and he educated me on this because I thought a similar thing. And he was saying that they actually eat a lot of shrubs, for the shrubs, over grasses, but I think that they will eat grasses as well, but they probably wouldn't have a horrible effect on the native grasses there.
Okay.
Just, actually, Marisa is pointing to a very interesting aspect of balance of rich communities versus poor communities in terms of biodiversity. What we learn is when you have a high composition of a species, native species on an area, that's kind of at the shell for that ecosystem to combat invasive plants in general. So the fact that we have one side of the organs more rich in diversity is helping actually this side to preserve itself rather than in the other side of the mountains. So that's an effect that we are seeing more clearly now. And yeah, Micah Funk actually, that will be hint for the organizers, maybe a good person to come and talk about oryx. He is one of my students, and he's actually studying the effect of oryx on not the Oregon mountains, but in the more flat areas around La Jornada area on native plants, and also with in terms of comparing behavior of raising oryx versus cattle. And we see that oryx actually is not as harmful as cattle is because it has more diverse diet. That's one of the things. So oryx goes with grasses, but also go with forests and shrubs. So it's the impact in the vegetation is not as bad as we will expect to see cattle impact in vegetation.
Oh yes, Helen?
I was just wondering if you're doing studies on the missile range.
No, I actually, that was, I wish, but there's a whole level of permission that I don't have. But hopefully future students that continue this work will be able to go in those areas.
Our club has had field days out there periodically, and they've been, really very welcoming, and it's been very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure of the permitting process, but I think that at least for research and data collection, I would have had to submitted some paperwork much prior to the fact of when I actually started. So I kind of missed the boat for that.
Yeah, I just have to shout out to Marisa here because she's really laying the foundation for a long-term monitoring project. And she's just bringing the baseline of a larger project that Dr. Pijanko and myself want to continue. So she's given us the steps to follow. And yeah, the idea eventually is to go to all the areas of the Oregon mountains. And like she said, to go into the missile range area, we need to get permission from several other agencies other than BLM. So that has to be done, and we are planning to do it. And now it feels that we can do it just because of Marisa's, Justin, and all these undergrad students helping us to collect all this data and making sense of what is a good protocol